It was their first night in their new neighborhood, a quiet village far from the hustle and bustle of the city. Franklin and his younger sister Amy had come outside to gaze at the full moon, its silver light washing over the tranquil streets. "It feels so good to leave the noise behind," Franklin said, his voice filled with relief. "This place is so peaceful." Amy smiled, but her thoughts were mixed. "I miss the city," she said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "I wonder what Mom and Dad saw here that made them want to move." They were still talking when they heard the sound of running footsteps, fast and urgent. Franklin stood up, peering over the fence to get a better look. "Maybe they're playing under the moonlight," he said, trying to make sense of the commotion. Amy tried to join him but stopped short when she saw the moon's bright glow. "It's the full moon tonight," she said, as if trying to explain the strange energy in the air. But before she could get any closer, Franklin screamed in terror. Amy turned to see him, but it was too late. He was frozen, motionless, as if turned to stone. Her heart raced as she screamed his name, but it felt as if her voice was swallowed by the eerie silence. She rushed to him, but before she could reach his side, she too was frozen in shock, unable to make sense of what she was seeing. The next few moments were a blur. Their parents rushed outside, hearing the screams, only to find Amy, trembling and pointing toward the still form of Franklin, now a cold, lifeless statue. "Franklin!" Amy managed to gasp, her voice barely a whisper, as she shook in fear. Her father hurried to touch him, but as his fingers made contact, Franklin crumbled into a pile of dust before their eyes. Panic set in. Amy's mother fell to her knees, crying out in horror as the dust scattered in the wind. Amy, still too shocked to speak, could only stare, frozen by the terror of what she had just witnessed. In a haze of fear and confusion, their father grabbed Amy by the hand and pulled her inside, trying to protect her from whatever unseen force had claimed their son. Inside, Amy could barely form words. She was still struggling to process what had happened. Her father's eyes were wild with fear, his red-rimmed gaze fixed on her. "Tell me what happened," he urged. But the words wouldn't come. Amy could only choke on the memories, her voice trapped in her throat. All she could manage to say was, "We heard people running. They were slamming their doors, like they were running from something. Franklin, he knew something was wrong. I thought they were just playing in the moonlight." But the rest of her words became lost in her mind. She tried, desperately, to make sense of it all, but it was like trying to speak through a veil of fear. Her father, overwhelmed by grief, ran outside again, but his wife remained inside, kneeling by the pile of dust that was once their son, unable to stop her tears. He tried to open the gate, but Amy, still silent and shaking, clung to his leg, her grip strong despite her inability to speak. It was clear, she didn't want him to go out there. The terror that had consumed Franklin was now gripping her too. Reluctantly, her father went back inside, his heart breaking. He knelt beside his wife, weeping like a child, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The night stretched on, a surreal blur of sorrow and fear. Maybe, he thought, it was all some kind of trick, a cruel illusion brought on by the full moon. Perhaps when the sun rose, Franklin would return, and it would all turn out to be some nightmare. But with each passing moment, that hope faded, leaving only dread in its wake. At the first light of dawn, their father Okono ran outside again, desperate to find some answers. The village around him was alive with the sounds of people starting their day, oblivious to the tragedy that had struck his family. He rushed to the nearest house, hoping someone could explain what had happened. The old man and his wife, however, pretended not to notice his distress. When Okono finally sank to the ground, tears streaming down his face, the old man dragged him inside and slapped him hard across the cheek. "Shut up," the old man barked. "Do you want me and my wife to die too? Why are you crying over your dead child in my house?" Okono's mind spun with confusion. "You knew about my son?" he asked, his voice shaking. The old man nodded grimly. "We heard the cries. We heard the voices. And we know you're new here." As the old man explained, Okono's heart sank. This place, this village, wasn't just quiet, it was cursed. The old man spoke of a time long ago when the community's leader died in his sleep without any explanation. It was an unnatural death, and in this village, Death by sleep was an abomination. The villagers had suspected foul play, and when the leader's 3 wives were accused of his murder, they were dragged naked through the village, humiliated in front of everyone, and then buried alive with their husband. The cries of those women, filled with agony and desperation, echoed through the village, but the people ignored them. The next night, the full moon rose, and the women's spirits returned, vengeful and furious. They killed nearly everyone in the village, leaving only a handful of survivors. The old man and his family were among them. They lost everything that night: their children, their homes, their future. As the real estate developers took over the land, the old man warned Okono of the curse that hung over it. "Once you buy a house here, you can't leave," he explained. "Try to leave, and they will turn you into a statue at the border. You can only leave when you sell the house to someone else. And no one can visit you. You're trapped here, bound by the curse of the women's revenge." The horror of it all began to settle in as Okono remembered the strange behavior of the man who had sold him the house. "The man who sold you the house," the old man continued. "He bought it for just 100,000, but 2 weeks after moving in, the full moon came. His wife, who had gone outside to relieve herself, saw the women's spirits and was turned into a statue. He was desperate to save her. That's why he sold the house to you, hoping to free his brother from the curse." Just as the old man finished speaking, Okono heard a scream from his own house. His heart raced as he ran back, only to be greeted by a sight more horrifying than any nightmare. His youngest daughter was lying on the ground, gasping for breath, while his wife ran frantically around the yard, desperate to save her. Okono's mind reeled. It wasn't just the curse of the moon, it was something far darker, and now it was threatening to consume everything he held dear. Okono, in a frenzy of desperation, scooped his dying daughter into his arms and ran toward the old man's house, hoping for some help. But when he reached their doorstep, the old man and his wife were quick to send him away. "Stop crying," the old man hissed. "The more you cry, the more they'll take your family, one by one." Okono's heart sank as he turned away, helpless, his mind filled with nothing but the agony of losing his children one by one. He rushed back to his car, clutching his daughter's fragile body. "I'm taking her to the hospital in the city," he screamed, his voice desperate as he started the engine. But as he sped down the road, the car suddenly cut out, the engine sputtering to a stop. Before Okono could comprehend what was happening, an unseen force reached through the passenger side, grabbed his daughter, and yanked her out of the car. Okono's heart froze as he watched in horror as the figure slashed his daughter's throat, the blood pouring out in a grotesque display of cruelty. His scream was lost in the night as he ran back to his house, leaving his car behind. At home, he found his wife in a frantic state, searching for their missing daughter. "Where is she?" she cried. Okono could barely speak as he stammered out, "They took her. They slashed her throat right before my eyes." His words were barely more than a whisper, the weight of the grief threatening to crush him. His wife collapsed in a heap, her sobs filling the room. They were no longer just victims of circumstance. They were trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape. For weeks, they didn't leave their compound. Fear gripped them, and they could not communicate with anyone from the outside world. The oppressive silence of their isolation stretched on for nearly 5 months, until one day, a knock came at their gate. Okono opened it cautiously, and there stood his wife's older brother, Jur, smiling, but his face quickly shifted to concern as he entered. They rushed him inside and poured out everything they had been through. Jur listened intently, his eyes full of sorrow. But when he pulled out his phone to show them a text message, they froze. The message was from them, detailing their exact address and how to reach them. Okono's heart sank even further as he checked his own phone and found no such message. "How did you find us?" his wife asked, her voice trembling. Jur looked grim. "I didn't send it, but someone did," he said. "I've been trying to contact you for months, but none of your lines went through. The message, it came out of nowhere. It seemed impossible. How had this happened?" Okono was desperate. "Please, Jur," he begged. "Help us. Help us get out of here. Help us find a buyer for the house, so we can leave this nightmare." But when Jur spoke to people about the house, the one sold to them at such a low price, everyone warned him of the danger. No one would sell a house for 100,000, one person said. That's a trap. Jer's concern grew, and eventually, he stopped responding to Okono's pleas. It was as though he had forgotten about them entirely, leaving Okono and his family to suffer in silence. A year passed, and the pain of their loss remained a constant companion. Okono's surviving son fell gravely ill, and the illness seemed to drain the very life from him. He grew weaker by the day, and one night, his condition worsened. He passed out, and as the fever raged, he began convulsing. Desperation took hold of Okono and his wife, and they screamed for help, but no one came. Whispers filled the air. People muttered in fear, afraid that Okono and his family were a threat, that their suffering would bring harm to everyone around them. Okono, now desperate beyond measure, did something unthinkable. He carried his son out into the night, knocking on doors, begging for anyone to help. But no one answered. "We're leaving tonight," he declared to his wife. She stared at him, wide-eyed and terrified. "But it's too late," she cried. "It's too dangerous." "We are leaving tonight," Okono insisted, his voice filled with a new resolve. He stepped outside and began shouting into the stillness of the night. "We're here. Come and get us. We're not part of your darkness, your killing. We won't be your victims any longer." His words echoed in the night, defiant and raw, but before he could continue, he felt the cold slash of a knife across his hand. The pain was blinding, but he didn't stop. Another slash cut into his arm, then another. Okono stumbled, but he refused to fall. He kept shouting, even as blood poured from his wounds. The unseen attackers were relentless, but Okono fought on, determined to make his stand. Then, something changed. One of the men in the village, someone who had been watching from the shadows, stepped forward, blocking the next knife strike. "Enough!" he shouted, his voice full of fury. "It's time to reclaim our freedom." One by one, the other men in the village came forward, brandishing knives but fighting without seeing the true enemy. They struggled against the invisible forces that had controlled them for so long, each one driven by a desire to break free. 4 hours, the battle raged, the village torn apart by the clash of blades. As the fight continued, the women of the village emerged, their cries filling the air. "We do not fight as warriors," they cried. "We fight as mothers. Our children must live. Our husbands must live. Our homes will not be deserted." Their voices rose in unison, powerful and pleading. In that moment, everything stopped. The knives fell silent, and the villagers knew they had won. They had overcome the darkness that had held them captive for so long. With the fight over, the men, bloodied and exhausted, were helped out of the village and onto the main road. They managed to find help just as dawn was breaking, and for the first time in years, the people who had been trapped in that cursed village were free. They had lost so much, but now they could leave it all behind. Okono and his family spent several days in the hospital, recovering from the horrors they had endured. When they returned home, they were greeted with a warm welcome, a feast thrown in their honor. The village, once under the dark influence of fear, was finally free, and the full moon no longer held any power over them. The terror that had plagued them for so long was finally over. But even after their liberation, the truth remained hidden. A year later, the old man and his wife, the true architects of the curse, succeeded in killing another man. They slashed his throat, hoping to make it look like the vengeful women were returning. But this time, the villagers would not be fooled. They marched through the streets, showing the world that they were no longer afraid. The old couple's lies were exposed, and the villagers learned the terrible truth. There had never been any vengeful women, no full moon curse, no cursed village chief. It had all been a fabrication. The old man and his wife, both wicked beyond measure, had killed their own children because they were different. They had made a pact with dark forces, using supernatural powers to wreak havoc on the community. But when Okono and the other villagers fought back, the old couple felt their own knives turn against them. In the end, they fled, not as conquerors, but as defeated souls, their power broken.